I ask our next speaker, Dan Work, are electric scooters in Stockholm part of an all-embracing transportation system? And he just said, wait, I will tell you, and here you are, and I will wait.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share some of the scary thoughts on scooters and also to congratulate Eva on 100 years. It's really a pleasure to be here and share some of the challenges I think we face on our transportation systems. What a great musical introduction to the challenges, right? It is this coupling of, yes, the sounds that sometimes irritate you are fantastically rich and beautiful in terms of the services that they provide. In transportation, that's no different. Today is always about moving goods and people, and it has been about moving goods and people. The modalities have changed, but as we think to the future, it's still going to be about moving goods and people. These are the things that enable our economy, our quality of life, access to goods, services, and jobs. What is changing is the fact that our transportation systems are getting more digitized. You could even argue that moving goods and people and bits will be the transportation systems of the future. What that allows us to do with more sensing and communication and control is the fact that we can start to design our transportation systems to be slightly more accommodating to the people that they serve, as well as the environment in which they operate. So what are the challenges we face when we design our transportation systems to be more accommodating? Well, here's a short list provided by the US National Academy of Engineering, and you see the spectrum of challenges that we face. I won't go through the full list, but just recognizing some of the complexities include the fact that transportation systems are critical infrastructure assets. And so as we think about resilience to natural disasters, to climate change, to man-made disasters, to terrorist attacks, those are grand challenge problems, recognizing that these are critical economic assets. If you look at just maybe a shorter list for today's talk, I really want to share some thoughts on transportation safety, on transformational technologies, and energy and sustainability. These three themes are actually deeply coupled together, and they span continental boundaries. They're really issues that face us on a global transportation scale. So what about safety? Well, first of all, we've made tremendous progress in road safety over the last 50 years, and yet we have so much further to go. If you look at the statistics, 1.2 million people will die this year in road crashes, and that number is just completely unacceptable. Despite the progress that we've made, tens of millions of people will be involved in crashes that lead to serious injuries. And these crashes, they're not born uniformly across the planet. If you are in a low-income country, you could be 3 to 10 times more likely per capita to be involved in a serious crash than a person who's coming from a developed economy. And that's just not okay. So what is happening now? Well, in 2010, we initiated a decade of action plan from the World Health Organization to really make transportation safety as important to human health as other issues related to human health that you might go see a doctor for. And that directly links with the UN sustainability goals. Target number 6 in Sustainable Development Goal number 3 is really about trying to reduce the fatalities on our roadway systems by 50% by 2020. By a show of hands, do you think that we're getting close to achieving that? Good. Whether you're paying attention or sleeping, the answer was still correct. We are not going to hit that goal. We still have tremendous progress that needs to be made in the future. Right now, crashes on roadways are the 8th leading cause of death. If you are under the age of 30, it is the single largest killer for people in that age group. And the risk factors are beyond simple. These are things like speeding and drunk driving and not using safety restraint devices. Okay? So you could even ask, are these really engineering challenges or are they policy challenges? And when you see the fact that less than 10% of the people, even a few years ago, live in communities where laws govern to best practices, the 5 major risk factors, almost nobody lives in those communities. The positive spin is that most people on Earth do live in communities that have laws that govern at least one of the major risk factors. Okay, these accidents, these crashes are also not born uniformly, right? If you are a vulnerable road user, a pedestrian, a cyclist, you are more likely to be, or at least by fraction of the total fatalities, half of those fatalities are coming to people that are actually outside of the vehicles that are causing those crashes. Okay, well, what can be done about it? I think you need to give credit where credit is due, and Sweden has been an international leader in proposing Vision Zero, which was really an ethical argument that we need to start designing systems so that they respect the physical limits of impacts that humans can sustain. That if you hit a person in a car traveling at 40 miles per hour, you will kill them. And if you hit them at 20 miles an hour, most likely they will survive. And so it really forces us to start designing our infrastructure systems to be more accommodating to people, recognizing that humans will make mistakes, and that we can design systems to allow those mistakes to occur in ways that don't ultimately kill people. And it works. It has driven Sweden from amongst the highest, close to where the United States is, accidents per capita, or fatalities more precisely, fatalities per capita, down to the very bottom in just 2 decades. And so that idea of Vision Zero is now spreading to communities across the globe, and it is actually having a positive impact in reducing the number of crashes. In terms of transformational technologies, you cannot talk about transportation today without recognizing the huge innovation and disruption that is occurring. This is happening in vehicle automation. One of the reasons people, on the technology side have been interested in automation is that it may be easier to force cars to drive in ways that respect laws and that constantly pay attention and can sense around its environment and drive safely than it can be to help humans drive more safely. We're looking at trying to electrify the vehicle fleet. We're looking at shared economy. If you put those 3 things together, it is an existential moment for most car companies. They are thinking about what the world looks like if I sell you a gas pickup truck or if I sell you as a service an electrified robo-taxi. And those are just 2 completely different outcomes under which they are trying to plan. As we look at autonomous vehicles specifically, you can ask, are autonomous vehicles a solution to traffic? Can we get rid of the congestion that we face every day in Stockholm by just putting all of our current cars and making them autonomous? And this answer actually needs to be sort of broken down into looking at the supply and demand side. On the demand side, if you give people services that are easy to use, i.e. automated, people will want more of that. In an example study that was done in Berkeley with a relatively small cohort, they gave people a chauffeur, which is the closest thing we have today to a completely brain-off autonomous vehicle. And people drove more across the cohort. More trips taken, retirees, people who typically wouldn't drive at night, felt comfortable driving at night. We actually had observed these so-called ghost trips, where the car goes to pick up your guests coming in to the city at the airport, rather than you going to pick them up. Well, that is a trip that in the future will have literally nobody in the car. So if you're frustrated in traffic now, imagine when you look around you and several of the cars in front of and beside you have nobody in them, and you can imagine sort of the frustration level that will increase, right? So technology may not just induce more demand, but it also has the possibility of changing. Sorry for the slides flashing here for a moment. It may also change the supply side. We have the possibility with technology to make cars drive very close together at very high rates of speed. And that is the recipe for high-capacity roadways. I'm showing you 2 videos, one from an experiment that was done 2 decades ago with cars that traveled at high speeds and close together, and another from Scania. They're developing truck platooning technologies that take advantage of the fact that even at close spacings, you get aerodynamic benefits on the order of potentially 6% reduced fuel consumption by the vehicles that follow behind. So if we can do this, this is really transformational. It allows you to, with technology alone, build a freeway on top of a freeway on top of your existing freeway. That's what tripling the capacity of the roadway does. But if you want to triple the capacity of the roadway, remember that you could just pick up 1 more person and that would automatically double the capacity of the roadway. Carpooling is not a new technology and yet still puts a freeway on a freeway. You pick up 4 people in your car, you've now done something that's almost physically impossible with technology. That's like bumper-to-bumper capacity. Right? So there are other ways to meet these capacity increases beyond just technology. This was probably most famously demonstrated in what are iconic photos in the transportation planning community from the Munster Planning Department. They look at the space that it takes up when you put people in buses compared to in single occupancy vehicles and in bikes. And if you automate the cars, they're going to take up the same physical space unless we redesign the physical size of these vehicles. So what can be done? It's important to recognize that cars and humans, as they interact, have emergent properties to the system. When we drive, we create traffic jams. I'm showing a video that most famously demonstrated this that was done in Japan. There's a bunch of cars that are driving around in a circle, okay? And all the humans are trying to just maintain a uniform spacing and constant speed, and yet they bunch up and create a so-called phantom traffic jam. These don't just happen in circles on isolated tracks, but you can observe these. This is a roadway in Georgia, and you'll see clusters of vehicles propagating on the roadway here, which are an artifact, again, of the way that humans drive, just like was demonstrated in the track. So if you change automation or introduce automation that changes the fact that it's no longer humans driving, but code, maybe you can manipulate the system in a way that actually gets rid of these annoying jams that are caused by humans. And so we designed an experiment to test this concept. The video I'm showing is just like we had before, where cars are driving in a circle. Initially, all these cars are under human control. And then what I'm going to do is the vehicle that's traced out by that black arrow, it is a self-driving capable car. We're going to switch it from being driven by a human to one where it's driven by code. And you see, again, this characteristic stop-and-go driving feature that pops up just due to the way that humans drive. And as we turn on the single vehicle that is now pacing the other vehicles, it is effectively removing this phantom traffic jam from the roadway. Why do you care? It has no impact on travel time, but it reduces the fuel consumed by all of the cars in the track, not just the one that's automated. In this stop-and-go setting to smooth flow, it reduced the fuel consumption by 40%. Okay? So this is an example where automation designed properly to accommodate its interaction with other human beings might actually have very positive short-term immediate benefits even before all the vehicles are level 5, brain-off driving, and before really just a fraction of the vehicles can be automated. So what can we say about automation in terms of energy consumption? I think what I'm hoping to show you is that the outcome of the future is uncertain. On one hand, some of the technologies may actually make our vehicles more fuel efficient. They may reduce the amount of energy consumed to get people to their destination. On other hand, it might induce demand. It might have more vehicles mile traveled, and we might end up with more energy for our overall transportation system. And so we really need to be careful about how we design these systems and how we let them evolve so that we get the benefits of better access and more goods and services without all the negative emissions that could come with future transportation systems. So that segues nicely into the sort of energy footprint of our transportation system. If you look at the global population and the number of cars that we currently have that are in use on Earth today, you will see that there's a big gap, which means that if we see over the next 50 years a continued growth in single occupancy vehicles to serve the mobility needs of people across the planet, we are going to have a huge increase in the environmental footprint of our mobility services. And just in contrast, look at how many cars per capita are in India compared to those that are in the United States. If we all move forward to the level of single occupancy vehicles like in the US, we're going to see the total number of vehicles on Earth increase substantially. More than 400 million cars were added in the last decade alone. So have that as kind of a background number that you're working with. And then if you look at in the current state in the United States where the energy comes from that serves the transportation services, well, a third of the energy that's produced in the United States goes into transportation, roughly, and almost all of that currently is based on fossil fuel-based sources. So there is a need to decarbonize our transportation systems. One way to do that is through electric vehicles. Obviously, it depends on what kind of carbon footprint the electricity is generated with. If you look at the two stars, it's clearly Norway and China. China in terms of total production volume of electric vehicles, and Norway with the fact that right now the total vehicle sales is almost hitting 50% of the market penetration in terms of electric vehicles due to some policies that were introduced to really shepherd in EVs into the fleet. And the forecasts look promising, right? Between 125 and 220 million cars by 2030. But keep in mind, over the last decade, we added on the order of 400 million new cars. If we add another 400 million new cars in use to meet additional mobility needs, even the EV penetration rates and uptake rates that are happening right now might not be enough to offset just the new total car demand. Okay, so we have to change those dynamics. And part of the reason why is because even the emissions that come from these vehicles, when they are gasoline powered, are having negative impacts in air quality that then is also in these dense urban areas where people are exposed. And so if you look at sort of the killers in the mobility space, as soon as we solve the problem where we're no longer having cars run into people and killing them, sort of the next wave of challenges we're going to face are recognizing that the tailpipe emissions are the slow killer. right? So we're going to have to start being more conscientious about the emissions that are coming out of our tailpipe as we continue to ask for, real-time delivery of goods and services in our communities. Okay, so I was promised that I would have a scooter in the slides, right? This is the micromobility future, right? On one hand, you couldn't ask for a better electric vehicle in a dense urban area, on one hand, okay? Why? Because look at how much energy it uses. If you look at trying to move a person in a dense urban area with a kilowatt hour of electricity, you can move that person 95 kilometers if you put them on a scooter, and about 4 kilometers if you put them in a much heavier Tesla. Okay, so order of magnitude, the scooters are the much more energy efficient way. They're small, they're light, and they serve mobility demands rather effectively from an energy perspective. And yet, what's happening to scooters in cities all over the world? By the way, how many people live in a community where scooters are currently present? And how many people are glad that they are there? Yep, okay. Why is that? Well, in my hometown in Nashville, we did a scooter test pilot. We terminated it early. We just kicked all the scooters out of our town. We're no different than the discussions that are happening right here in Stockholm. Should we get rid of the scooters after a fatality? Well, let's go to Auckland and see what their threads are. Or how about, I don't know, in France or in Atlanta? Everybody that has these demos of scooters are thinking about getting rid of them, and it goes full circle because it's actually related to safety. Right? In addition to the hazards of having this sort of clutter all over the infrastructure and they're not really parked in the right spots, look at it from the Vision Zero perspective, right? What about safety? Well, a Tesla driving in the United States drives about, not a Tesla specifically, but any car in the United States drives more than 1 million miles before an injury occurs. And for a scooter, those numbers, small sample size, I only had 2 months of data from Austin, Texas to actually calculate this with, but we're looking on the order of 4,600 miles before there's a serious injury. The infrastructure today that is out there is not able to support scooters in their current form. People are not trained on how to use them. They don't know whether they go on the roads or in the sidewalks. And as a consequence, even the fact that it's a very small wheel and you put it on a cobblestone road, it creates safety challenges. The infrastructure and the sort of new mobility, micromobility, they weren't designed in thinking together, and as a result, they just don't work. It works brilliantly from an environmental perspective and horribly from a safety perspective. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, I'm hoping to show you that, the challenge of moving goods and people, now and into the future, it's not going to go away. That will be the transportation challenges that we face. Transportation technology, we're at an inflection point, right? The technologies from deep learning and artificial intelligence, they are invasive in transportation, they're pervasive in transportation, they will disrupt transportation, but depending on how we let them evolve, we might see them support less sort of people-centric and sustainable-centric evolutions, or we might see them be more embracing of people and the planet, and we have to, as a community, help shepherd in sort of the positives. The challenge that we will face, the scooter is just a small example, is that when you try to link these digital innovations with the infrastructure timescales, scooters came and went in basically a year in my hometown, and we added a few miles of bike lanes in that same period of time, right? When you think about re-architecting the footprint of a city, you're talking about generations, decades, 50, 100 years before you can have substantial change in terms of what the infrastructure footprint looks like. And technology is operating on a 6-month time scale or a 3-month time scale. And those are just wholly incompatible. And so we need to make our infrastructure a lot more sort of accommodating and flexible and adaptable if we're going to have any hope of taking advantage of all these digital transformations that are occurring. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. How much does the size of the city influence the solution of the infrastructure system? And will we see many, many different kinds of systems in different parts of the world, do you think?
Yeah, so the question about city size and transportation solution is an interesting one. Obviously, dense cities are much easier to serve in terms of getting people access to goods and services. We really make a distinction between mobility and access, although we commonly interchange them in the popular press. Access is what we're actually after. We want to get to jobs. We want to get to services. The fact that we travel 2 blocks or 10 miles to do it is actually independent in terms of the solution. What we want is the end result. And so dense cities are much, much easier to serve those access needs without mobility than those that are spread out. And so the word of caution I would warn folks is that as we think about autonomy and the fact that cars might have nobody in them, there's two alternating outcomes. One where cities densify because we don't need cars, we don't own cars, and so there's no need to park them. The alternative is that I take advantage.
They're always moving around.
They're always moving around, and I don't own it. It's just shared and there. You could also imagine a scenario where I still own an autonomous vehicle, and because I can email, or more importantly, watch Netflix on my commute, I choose to live even further away than before because the cost to me of travel has actually been reduced to the point where it now makes sense to live further away. So these two sort of densification of cities due to technology or expansion of cities due to technology are sort of the extremes of what we can expect.
So we can actually include non-urban environments into the discussion as well?
I think they have to be, recognizing that in rural communities, particularly in the United States, those are still the places where we have a lot of the food production, right? The freight and movement of pure goods is something that on a global scale is important, even if it's not something that you or I face when we're thinking about our commute on a daily basis. The freight part is still critical, certainly in rural areas as well as urban.
Yeah. We will see a lot more of Dan. We'll just have another speaker and then we'll group you in a panel.
Sounds good.
Be ready for the next section of this. Thank you so much, Dan.